Today's share is sponsored by Sarah Bas Esther Pega. Okay, as follows. We'll start like this. In what did you say? In the news last week. No. In the news in 1928, there was a get-together of students who were anti-Semitic. They were fascist. They were probably socialist, communists. They got together in the town of Grosvedan, which was one of the larger Jewish communities in Romania between the two world wars. And in 1928, they had a big conference with hundreds of students and maybe thousands of students. And at the end of the conference, in like a bout of inspiration, they rampaged through the city of Grosvedan and they collected 60 Sifrei Torah from all the different shuls that they could find. And they burnt them in the streets, and they used them to create flags, and they used them to make shoes. And it was a great bizayon for the Sifrei Torah of Grosvedan. From there, they continued on to the town of Kloisenberg, and from there to another town, and they repeated this rampage through several towns in Romania. Now, the people, the Rabbanim, the Kehilas were obviously shook, and it became a big discussion what to do about this terrible thing that happened. The Sifrei Torah were burnt. Now, I think everyone has this thing in their head. We all know kind of that if, since you're a kid, you've heard this. If a Sifrei Torah falls, everyone has to fast. Everyone in the shul has to fast. Everyone who saw it has to fast. Maybe everyone from the Kehila has to fast. There's a lot of different nuschayos of who exactly has to fast and what has to fast. But makairis for these exact prescribed fasts that happen when a Sifrei Torah falls or is damaged or burnt are very hard to come by. They're few and far in between. So the Rabbanim of the time, in 1928, there's many different kisveyes. The Rabbanim submitted different letters trying to establish the protocol of what should happen, and v'chulu. Later on, the Tzitz Eliezer in 1956, after a terrorist attack in Eretz Yisrael that also saw several Sifrei Torah burnt, he publishes a kuntris in the beginning of Chelik Hey in Tzitz Eliezer. He publishes a kuntris called Shali Zrufa Be'esh, which is about the makairis and the sources for fasting and for whatever else might be included when the Sifrei Torah gets damaged or burnt, and etc. Now, the just by way of background, and this is just to get this out of the way. By way of background, there's a Gemara in Moed Katan that says as follows. It's a very interesting Gemara. The Gemara says as follows. The Gemara talks about the Megillas Eicha from Yirmiyahu. Megillas Eicha was written by Yirmiyahu, and it was brought in front of the Melech Yehoyakim, and it was read in front of him, and ultimately he burns it. Now, it goes as follows. They brought the Gemara wants to know. There's a din. The Mishnah in Moed Katan, Daf Chav Daled says that a Sefer Torah Shenikra has a din of kriya. If a Sefer Torah gets burnt, a person has to rip his clothing. So the Gemara says, where do you know this din that Sefer Torah Shenikra, this din of kriya? So the Gemara says as follows. It says the pasuk says in Yirmiyahu, "Vayihi kichraya Yehudi shalish lasis." They read for Yehoyakim from the Megillah, and it says as follows. They told Amru leHayakim. They told Yehoyakim, Kativ Yirmiyahu Sefer Kinnis. Yirmiyahu wrote a Sefer of Kinnis, predicting the demise of your kingdom, of Eretz Yisrael. Amaluhu Maksiv Bey. Vashteit in the Sefer Kinnis that Yirmiyahu wrote. What does it say in there? So they started reading. They said, it says, Eicha Yashva Vadad. So it says, how does she sit all alone? Yerushalayim sits desolate. To which Yehoyakim's rejoinder is, Amalei Ana Malka. But it doesn't say anywhere in Eicha Yashva Vadad that I'm not the king still. Binachal's the king. Okay, not a problem. Amrullah, they told him, Yirmiyahu said, B'choy Sivke Balayla, she's going to cry at night. Klal Yisrael's going to cry at night. Amar, Ana Malka. I'm still the king, right? So there's nothing to worry about. Galsa Yehuda Me'ayni, Klal Yisrael is going to be in Galus, in total destitute. Ana Malka, I'm still the king. Darkei Tzion Avelus, Ana Malka, I'm still the king. Then they got to the pasuk that says, Hayut Tzarel L'Roish, the Hayut Tzarel L'Roish, even the Rashim, even the heads are going to be made little and made small by this terrible thing that's going to happen to Yerushalayim. So suddenly Yehoyakim pops up his head. He says, "Amalei Man Amra." Who's the mechaber of this kina? And he has it burnt, and Yirmiyahu chased out of Eretz Yisrael. So Stamazeh, there's a great insight into human nature. My father always likes to say, when you hear a tragedy or something, you always look for like a reason, but this, but that. You never want to allow it to be internalized. Like a kataka applied to me also. Yehoyakim showed like a great insight into human nature. Like as long as it didn't touch his caviar, he was fine. V'ana Malka, I'm still king. But once it penetrates, so then Yehoyakim gets enraged and he burns the Sefer Torah. He burns the Megillah Sefer. And says the Gemara that the din was that it says the people who were standing around ripped their clothing because the Sefer Torah was ripped. So from here's the makar that when the Sefer Torah is ripped or damaged, that there's a chi of kriya. Now, how to get from a chi of kriya to a chi of fasting. That's something that's a little bit unknown. And in these contrasim that were published after different tragedies, everyone tries to source it. It's not brought down in Shulchan Aruch or the Ramah, obviously. It's later than that this official minig, becomes mamish kavua. And where the source is a little bit unclear. Now, a potential source, and this is what it has to do with today's topic, is as follows. The Shulchan Aruch and Siman Tav Kuf Pei, and we've mentioned this before, talks about all the extra prescribed tanesim that are called tanis tzadikim. Tanesim that are not for everyone, that are not, they're additional taniyos that are added for different tragedies and events that happen through Klal Yisrael's history. Now, in the end of the Siman, in Sif Gimel, the Mechaber says as follows. Yesh mishaymer, shagazru sheyim esanim b'chol sheni v'chamishi, that there are those who say that there was a gzeira that people should fast every sheni v'chamishi, al chorban habayis, because of the chorban habayis, v'al ha-Torah shenisrafa, and because of the Torah that was burnt, that was destroyed, v'al chilul Hashem. And la'asad lava, he says the Mechaber, Yehafchem Hashem l'sasan u'l'simcha. Now, what the Mechaber is quoting, the Goyen says it comes from Masechtas, it comes really, it's two places. In the end of Masechtas Seifrim and in the end of Megillas Tainis. It's brought down with two different girsayos. The Goyen makes the Girsa Shtim, which is a piece for itself. That seems to be the source, that because of HaTorah shenisrafa, the Torah that was burnt during the Tkuf of the Chorban, is a reason to justify having a fast every Monday, Thursday, and Monday for all time, for the rest of the Gullus. So you see over here, the first time a fast is employed as a remedy for the Torah being burnt. Now, okay, granted, this is much more severe than any individual Sefer Torah being burnt. This refers to the way that Arizal says it, to the Torah being dispersed into Gullus, and the Torah itself losing some of its shine, meaning the Torah being not something that Klal Yisrael could really be makasha themselves to, which is granted a much, much more severe Sreifas HaTorah than just the Sreifas HaTorah that we're talking about. But herein lies the kernel, that Sreifas HaTorah is like a source for a tainus. Now, on this brings the Magen Avram, and this is why it's seasonal. The Magen Avram brings as follows. He brings from the Sefer Tanya Rabasi, which is a Talmud of the Ram, which says as follows. Kasav Tanya. B'yom HaShishi, on the 6th day of the week of Parshas Chukas, which is going to be this upcoming Thursday, Nagu Yechidim Lesanis. There's a minig by Yechidim to fast. Sheba Oisei HaYoyim, on that day, Nisrfu, and the version that he brings is Nisrfu Chaf Kronos, Maleim Svarim B'Tzarfas. 20 wagons full of Svarim, not Sefer Torah, 20 wagons full of Svarim were burnt in France on that day, and they were geyser to make a fast. Now, the Tanya Rabasi addresses the obvious question. He says almost everything that's on the Jewish calendar is connected to a date, not to a day. Vav Parshas Chukas is a day, not a date. It should be, the day was Chaf Tammuz, so let it be Chaf Tammuz. Well, why is it the day of the week? That's an odd way to be Kaveh Tainus. He says, they asked in a dream, what caused this? It was revealed to them that the Gzeira, that the reason what caused it was the date. Because was revealed to them in the dream, it said as follows, so it had to do with Parshas Chukas. It had to do with the Parsha of the week and not the date. So therefore they would kaveh it forever on Yom Vav Parshas Chukas. Now this is a fast that was in somewhat use until the Holocaust. I think today it's come out unheard of that someone would fast on Vav Parshas Chukas. But this is a fast that the Magen Avram feels fit to bring in light of the din that the Shulchan Aruch says that on Sreifas HaTorah there's a fast. Brings the Magen Avram that there's a Tanya Rabasi, and it's brought down in the Shibalei Aleket like this as well, that there's a fast on Yom Vav Parshas Chukas, which is about Sreifas HaTorah. So now I want to talk about A, the fast of Yom Vav Chukas, and B, the inyan of Sreifas HaTorah in the first place. So now, as follows. Let's just give the background of what the Tanya Rabasi is referring to. So now, the Balei HaTosfos in the 1100s and 1200s, Rashi's grandchildren and great-grandchildren, and from there on, lived in Germany and France. That's primarily where they lived. They shared. A lot of them used to travel back and forth from the yeshivas of one to the other to learn by each other. Now probably the Gadol Hadar, but certainly the leader of the Balei HaTosfos, the school of the Balei HaTosfos in that time in the early 1200s, was Rabbi Chil MiPariz. Rabbi Chil MiPariz is a Talmid, Talmidei Talmidim of Rabbeinu Tam, contemporary, overlaps with Rabbeinu Tam. Rabbi Chil MiPariz is the Gadol Hadar of the school of the Balei HaTosfos. Now he had a Talmid who becomes a Meshumid. A Talmid of his who goes with the Derech and becomes a terrible Meshumid. The Talmid's name was Nicholas Danin of New Rochelle, the original New Rochelle in France. Nicholas Danin of New Rochelle, and he makes a big push to have Jews converted, to have Jews baptized by force. And in the town of New Rochelle, where he was influential, he had 500 Jews baptized by force. He had several Jews killed. Nicholas Danin was a terrible Rasha, a terrible Meshumid. Now, in the 1230s, he sends a letter to Pope Gregory IX, who's the Roman Catholic Pope at the time, with like a charging document with 35 tainas on the Gemara. 35 different tainas about how the Gemara is anti-Christianity, B, anti-Goyim B'chlal, and he sends a 35-page charging document to Pope Gregory to show him what the Talmud is all about. Now, Pope Gregory, I don't think needed much convincing to be inflamed by Nicholas Donen's charging statements, and he sends out a papal bull, like a letter to all the different kingdoms that are mishtayech to the Roman Catholic Church, where he says, do something about this. If you have Jews and you have Talmuds that are within your domain, you got to do something to fix this, because look what the Talmud is full of. Now, the only king from the kings who was under his domain who took this to heart was Louis IX, who was the king of France at the time. And Louis IX on Shabbos in either 1240 or 1242 or 1244, depending on which girsa you go with, had his soldiers burst into the shuls of Paris on a Shabbos afternoon and gather up, not the Sifrei Torah. They left the Sifrei Torah because in Nicholas Donen's polemic, it said nothing against what it says in the Torah. Torah Shebiksav he had no problem with. They gathered up every sefer they could find. His problem was with Torah Shebal Peh. His problem was with Svarim, with the Talmud. Gathered up every sefer they could find, which, depending on either the Tanya Rabbasi's count, was 20 wagons full. The Shibbolei Aleket's count was 24 wagons full, which was an immense amount of Svarim. When Svarim wanted to be written by hand and had to be copied one from the other, that was an immense amount of Svarim to collect from Paris. He drained all the yeshivas of the Balei HaTaisis that were in Paris and brought them to his palace. He then summons Rabbi Chilmi Pariz to have a debate with Nicholas Donen to defend the Talmud. He gives him an opportunity to defend the Talmud. You can prove if it's right or it's wrong. The debate happens on June something in 1242, let's say. June, I think, 13th in 1242, where Rabbi Chilmi Pariz, together with his son-in-law in Talmud, the Yitzchak of Kubriel, and one of his contemporaries, the Sar Mikutzi, the Machaber, the Smak, some of the very famous Balei HaTosfos, not obscure Balei HaTosfos, go to debate with Nicholas Donen and the Chevraya of Dominican monks about the veracity of the Talmud, if the Talmud is okay or bad. Now, obviously, it was a debate where the answer was set before the debate started. There was nothing really to debate, and over a period of 2 days, they debated back and forth, and many of the conversation we actually have preserved today, because either Rabbi Chilmi Pariz himself or Rabbi Shlomo ben Avram, a Talmud of his who was part of the debate team, one of them preserved the debate like the Charuzim. It's in a few pages, like in rhymes, and it's sad and beautiful at the same time. Wrote it over for us, and even though it wasn't published until hundreds of years later, today we have it. It's in the Eitzer Vikuchim from J.D. Eisenstein. Also, the Dominicans published it themselves in the early 1600s. They published the minutes of the debate, and it's pretty similar. B'chol and the debate went on for 2 days. And at the end of the debate, it was gepaskint that the Talmud had to be burnt in Paris. No Talmuds were going to be allowed in Paris. And the famous time that it was burnt was Vav Parshas Chukas in the year of either 1240, 1242, or 1244, depending on who you ask. It was burnt on Friday, Vav Parshas Chukas, in the square of a palace, which is again a point of contention where that square is today. But it was burnt over there. Many, many wagon loads were burnt. And this was actually an edict that was reiterated several times later. Over the next 60 years, until Jews were kicked out of France, in Gansen, until the early 1300s, when the kings kicked Jews out of France completely, every several years, the Talmud was burnt in different cities in France, in Paris, in different cities in France. Now, so there's two very famous reactions to this burning of the Talmud. The first one is less muchach, but one of the contemporaries at the time writes that in light of the burning of the Rambam's Moreh Nevuchim in Hilchos Deis, which happened, maybe only 10 years before that, Hashem saw fit that as an Einish V'Klal Yisrael, if you're going to burn Svarim, then your Svarim will be burnt. Now, it's slightly unlikely because how do I know? I was going to say it's slightly unlikely because the Balei HaTosfos who lived in Paris were not involved in the burning of the Rambam's Ksav Mechlal. It was a different school of Rishonim. The Balei HaTosfos in Paris, actually, some of them were great defenders of the Rambam, but I realize as I'm saying that for me to even try to calculate what HaKadosh Baruch Hu's cheshbonos could or couldn't have been is silly, so I'll just repeat it that it's gizakt. It is said that in light of the burning of the Rambam, the burning of the Talmud, whether or not it makes sense, like that they're responsible for them, I don't know how this works anyhow, so fine. That is what it is. Now, a second famous response is the kinna that we say every year on Tisha B'Av It's Kinem Em Aleph, Shali Srufa Be'esh. It's written by the Merami Rotenberg, who was a 20-year-old Talmud of Rabbi Chilmi Paris at the time of the Sreifa. He was learning in Paris by Rabbi Chilmi Paris. It's likely that he witnessed some of these events with his own eyes. And he writes a heart-wrenching kinna that we say every summer. It's in Nusach Ashkenaz, the way we say it's kinna Mem Aleph, and it's Shali Srufa Be'esh, and he refers to the Torah. The Torah is referred to as Srufa Be'esh, she who was consumed by fire, which is interestingly in the school, in the world of Piyut, is a bit of a chiddush, and I'll tell you why. Because Torah is a feminine word. Torah is a lashon nekeva, the word Torah. But Talmud, which is referred to Torah Shabbal Peh, Talmud is a masculine word. It's a lashon zachar. Now, normally when Piyutim are written describing the Talmud, the Torah Shabbal Peh, they're written in lashon zachar, not lashon nekeva. Rami Rottenberg's chiddush, you could call it in Piyut over here, is to refer to the Torah Shabbal to the Torah Shabbal Peh in a feminine language. Shali Srufa Be'esh, she who is consumed by fire, which is a feminine way of referring to the Torah. And there are those who say, now you can take it or leave it, there are those who say that Hayos, the attack of Nicholas Danin, was on Torah Shabbal Peh. When they came to the shul, they didn't take the Sifrei Torah. Torah Shabbal Chsav, no problem, have that, that's good. Torah Shabbal Peh was the attack. Then Rami Rottenberg wanted to convey in his piyut that by uns, it's all one thing. By us, Torah Shabbal Chsav, Torah Shabbal Peh is all Hasrufa Be'esh. It's the Torah Hasrufa Be'esh, it's all the same. And to convey that, he bedafka used lashon nekeva when he described the Torah Shabbal Peh. Maybe. Now, b'chaleifin, it's a piyut that endured for a long time, for hundreds and hundreds of years, and it's a piyut that reveals the pain and the suffering of the French Jewry in light of the Sreifas HaTorah. Now, all I'm describing over here is how consequential and monumental Sreifas HaTorah was in Klal Yisrael's history, and how it leaves such a lasting impact of fast days and kinnis and etc. And it's a big deal. So now, in light of that, I want to move on to a few different shilas of Jews burning Torah themselves, which once we framed it by showing the Chemra Advarim and how consequential it is in our history, and even in some dinim that made it to Shulchan Aruch, I want to frame it and now showcase a few chuvas, interesting chuvas about burning Torah Jews burning Torah on their own. Now, there's a famous, semi-famous fight between two mechutanim, two great Talmidei Chachamim, two mechutanim, two famous meshivim in the 1700s about this topic. The Shuvas Yaakov is a famous Shuvah Sefer, and the Knesset Sichaskel is a slightly less famous Shuvah Sefer, but they were mechutanim, and they write back and forth to each other on this topic. Now, what they bring is as follows. The Shuvas Yaakov was posed to Shaila in Taf Pei Gimel, which is 1733, early 1700s, 1733. The Shuvas Yaakov is posed to Shaila about a community who lives clearly in a ghetto and does not have enough space for their shemus. There's nowhere to store it. And what's happening is the shemus is being left all over. In the corner of the shul there was a pile of shemus, and the side of the street there was a pile of shemus. It ends up blowing around, it ends up disappearing, it ends up getting damaged. And worst of all, what he describes, what ends up happening is that toilet paper was in short supply, it was in high demand, like Corona days, and passing Goyim would see a book, lying there in the corner of the floor, a ripped up book. It makes a perfect roll of toilet paper, and they take it home with them, and that would be the end of the sefer. And the shaila presented to the Shuvas Yaakov is what's to do to remedy this terrible shemus situation. To which the Shuvas Yaakov suggests, and he says as follows: he thinks that in such a situation it would be permitted for the Yidden to burn their shemus instead of piling it up and planning on burying it, and there's no room and there's no time and it never happens and it ends up getting disused and embarrassed and fashemt. He says just burn the shemus. Like that, you have a solution which is not a bizayin. You hear that you burn the shemus, which is not a bizayin, because chach, you're preventing it from falling into people's hands that it shouldn't and doing things that they shouldn't do with it. So just take it and make a medura every year, and we'll burn our own shemus, and that's it. And then you solve the problem. Now, the Shuvas Yaakov brings some rayas to this conclusion. What he wants to say is, we spoke about this once before. Shaul HaMelech, when he sees that he's going to fall into the hands of the Plishtim and he's going to be killed in battle, and he's worried that they're going to torture him or mivaz his body, he asks his servant boy, he says, take out my sword and stab me, kill me, so that I don't fall into the hands of the Plishtim. And he says, Shaul kills himself. Shaul commits suicide to prevent him from falling into the hands of the Plishtim, etc. He says, so you see that if you're worried that if you don't kill yourself or you don't do the act yourself, you're going to fall into the hands of something worse or something more damaging, then you're allowed to do it by yourself, and you don't have to wait for it to happen in a more damaging way. It says the Shvus Yaakov, this is a raya, that if a person's concerned that the shemus is going to fall into the hands of Goyim or going to be mevazid in a worse way, burn it yourself so that it shouldn't. It's doing with the Shalom Melech committing suicide. Burn it yourself so that it doesn't fall into the hands of Goyim or going to be mevazid further. Now, clearly, there's some distinctions here. Others, the Chesed Avram asks that, it's an interesting way to ask it. The Chesed Avram asks that by erasing Hashem's name, the pasuk says, "Leisason kein LaHashem lekecha." You shouldn't do it to Hashem lekecha. Don't erase Hashem's name. The Gemara in Shabbos makes a diak from Leisason kein LaHashem lekecha. Asiya is asur, but grama is mutter. You're not allowed to actually erase Hashem's name, but to cause it the grama is mutter. So says the Chesed Avram, there's a clear distinction to be had between suicide, where killing someone begrama is asur too, and you have and Shaul, and Shaul did it to Sreifas HaTorah, where if you cause it to get burnt, you're not even being over an Isser. So he says, if you just leave it and someone else is mavazeh, you're not even being over l'sasan ken l'Hashem lekecha. As opposed to when you burn it b'yadayim, you're being over l'sasan ken l'Hashem lekecha. One's no Isser and one's an Isser Chomer. It's not a good sushto. The Shvus Yaakov brings more rayas to this effect, that they burning it, you prevent it from falling into the Goyim's hands, and that's allowed. He says he brings Kavachem from.
If you could do the suicides.
So the Shvus Yaakov says that in his third tshuva, he says that he calls it a Kavachemer. He learns from Shaul, he calls it a Kavachemer. His problem is that he has a Be'er Sheva that came before him, where the Be'er Sheva brings already Paiskim who handled burning the shemus, and the Be'er Sheva says Shrek look terrible and brings rayas that he can't do it. So to which he answers, Ein done an efsher mishi efsher. Yeah, you're right. L'chatchila, I'm not saying that the proper prescribed methodology to dispose of shemus is streifa. Of course not. That's not the din. That's not how it's kapaskin. That's not what you should do. But when it's not possible, you have to do it this way. Now, I'll just tell you that in Eretz Yisrael, in the early 2000s, there was a huge mevucha about shemus. There was a ton of shemus that wasn't being disposed of properly. It was being gathered and being brought to shemus places, and they were finding that it was just left, abandoned in a field, in rocks, in a cave. It wasn't being buried, it wasn't being taken care of. And this shaila was risen again. It was brought to Rabbi Yashiv that maybe the proper solution to shemus is to just burn it, and then it wouldn't be a problem. Rabbi Yashiv it's quoted by Yitzchak Zilberstein in the Sefer Malachim and Munayach, where he brings that they found precedent that during the Holocaust, certain towns who already knew what their fate was going to be, as the Nazis were approaching, would go to their own shul, take out all their Sefer Torah, and burn it before the Nazis got there. Because they knew that once the Nazis got there, they'll make sandals and lampshades out of the Sefer Torah, and to avoid that, they burnt it themselves. So there was precedent to be seimach on this Shvus Yaakov. Ain't done enough shemishi after. It's not possible. You have to do this. They went to Rabbi Yashiv with this precedent, with the Tshuva of the Shvus Yaakov, and Rabbi Yashiv said that not only don't we paskin like the Shvus Yaakov, the people who during the Holocaust burnt their own Sefer Torah did the wrong thing. He says, Tshuva they don't need. They had all of that they could use. Tshuva they don't need. And it was a time of the Efsher, and you can't even dan them. But Zichar Ladina, that's not the din. And after that, they formed the whole new Vad for Shemus. There's a sefer called Ginzei HaKodesh by Rabbi Cheskel Fein, I think, not Rabbi Cheskel, Yecheskel Feinhandler, put out a sefer called Ginzei HaKodesh. In the English edition of Ginzei HaKodesh, in the back, he has a whole contrast about the formation of the Vad HaShemus, like in Eretz Yisrael, that was opened in light of this discussion, and all the different innovations, and what they fixed, and who the Rabbanim are. You can take a look there if you want to see. But in this Shvus Yaakov, this kula of the Shvus Yaakov, if you want to call it that allows Jews to burn their own svarim, it becomes relevant at different times of great need, like during the Holocaust, or when Shemus is found to be laying all about. Now, the Knesset Yecheskel writes with great derech eretz and covet him back, and he says that it's a tayus what he's saying. He shows him many Gemaras, and you're missing off in the Gemaras, and it's not allowed, and v'chulu. To which the Shvus Yaakov writes back, sticking to his heter, and b'chol even it exists. This machlek is the Shvus Yaakov and the Knesset Yecheskel about allowing Jews to burn their own shemus. Now, an interesting time that I noticed it come up again, I found on Yitzhak Chachma, in 2005, Ariel Sharon announced that he was going to take all the Jews out of Gush Katif. Right? He was going to. We all remember that taking all the Jews out and etc. Now, the government asked the Rabbanut of Eretz Yisrael the shaila as follows. Obviously, kicking Jews out of their homes and taking them out, that's kapaskin. That they weren't asking, which the writer of the tshuva is baklocking zich about, that they didn't ask him that. But they're taking the Jews out. Now the question is, there's going to be shuls that were left over in these communities, and yeshivas that were left over in these communities, and heaven knows what the Arabs are going to come afterwards are going to do to be mevazeh these mekaymes hakdoshim that exist in the Gush. Would it be permitted for the army to destroy these shuls on the way out? Take, controlled explosives and destroy the shuls so that at least the Arabs that come after don't destroy the shuls in a bizayin way. Now this is a tshuva, I found the whole kuntras about it, and in it, one of the primary, so first the Meshiv discusses if breaking a shul is asa midiraisa, midirabanon, if that's included in l'sasing and l'shem lekecha, and then he goes on to handle this shaila, and he brings this machlekes, the Shvus Yaakov and the Knesset Yichaskel. He says, l'chayra, according to the Shvus Yaakov, that if you're worried that something heilig is going to fall into disrepair and become, mevuzeh, he says then the right thing to do is to destroy it yourself. So according to the Shvus Yaakov, l'chayra, the IDF on their way out of the Gush Katif should destroy all the shuls so that later on, Arabs that come behind them shouldn't be able to destroy it. He pilpels zich back and forth, and Tzimseif, he ends up saying, not like this, in light of what most places seem to hold, that the halach is like the Knesset Yichaskel, that we don't destroy things to prevent them from maybe falling into greater bizayon and greater harm. It's a long tshuva, but it was just a very interesting application of this machlekes Knesset Yichaskel and Shvus Yaakov that pops up again. Now, I'll just cover one more shaila quickly. I don't know how much we get into. One more shaila quickly about burning svarim is as follows. There's a tshuva that was discussed. It started in Europe, but it made it to America later, where it seems in certain typhus wards, when people got typhus, they would put them in an isolation unit, and the rules of the isolation unit was that whatever would come in with the patient would not come out. On the way out, everything that came in was incinerated in order to prevent the spread of infectious diseases. I think that when Ebola became a thing in Africa, the biocontainment protocol is the same. You burn all the personal effects of the person who has it because it's an airborne thing and it attaches itself, you burn everything. Now, the shaila would be as follows. Someone who got typhus and was confined to a biocontainment ward, could you bring him tefillin or svarim to wear? Well, tefillin is the biggest mitzvah because svarim, okay, you don't have svarim. If you know some Mishnayos Papel, learn some Mishnayos Papel. If you don't, you're an inus. You don't have svarim, nothing you can do. Now, tefillin is a mitzvah saseh, you can't be mekayim by just saying pasuk and kriya shema like the mitzvah of Talmud Torah. So, should you bring a person tefillin into thing, and he's going to be there for a few weeks, he'll wear his tefillin every day, but ultimately that at the end of it, his tefillin will be burnt, it's going to be incinerated. Now here's a little more of a dakastik shaila than the shaila before this, because over here, you're only responsible for burning the tefillin, meaning realistically speaking, the minute you bring it in, it's as good as burnt, because it ain't coming out of there not burnt. So there's nothing you can do. You know that by bringing it in, you're already causing it to be burnt. But there's a certain element of distance over here where you yourself are not burning it. You're exposing it to the danger of getting burnt, and I guess you could tell yourself, who knows, maybe by the time in 3 weeks, the protocol for infectious diseases will change. They'll have a disinfectant spray that they'll use instead, and you'll be able to get it out. Meaning it's not a sure thing on the same level as taking a match and lighting it to the corner of a sefer. Now, there's a tshuva sefer called Imre David from before the war, where he writes that he was traveling to the bathhouses in, I forget where, Riskovitz, I don't even know where that is, and he says the handlerai in the bathhouse over there was what to do about people who get isolated in infectious disease wards. Could you bring them tefillin? And he doesn't have an answer, but he brings a few gemaras like this, a few gemaras like that, some rayas, lakan, and he doesn't have a conclusive thing. Now, in Rav Moshe, Igros Moshe Chelik Aleph, or Chaim Chelik Aleph, Rav Huntner writes to Rav Moshe with the same shaila. It's literally like from the first few shailas of Igros Moshe. Or Chaim Chelik Aleph, Tshuva Daled, Rav Huntner writes to Rav Moshe asking the same question. Rav Moshe strongly feels that it's asur to bring tefillin into an isolation ward where it's going to lead it to be burnt. He paskins that it's asur. Rav Huntner writes back. Rav Gifter writes a letter over there. Others contribute, all with different rayas, lakan to argue on Rav Moshe Psak. Rav Moshe systematically goes through all of them, and he stands, hu b'shaloi, that to bring tefillin into an isolation ward that's going to cause it to get burnt is asur. It's the same thing. It's b'chlal, a yid not burning svarim, b'chlal yanadin. Now, there's just one interesting maramakim that I'm not going to have to go into all the gemaras that they bring, but there's one interesting maramakim that someone, Reb David Singer, asks Rav Moshe from. He says there's a tshuva in the Ramah. It's tshuva Yid Aleph in the Shot Ramah. It's a strange tshuva. We don't know. No one knows what it's referring to. But the Ramah writes about a story. He says where he and other rabbanim were forced to be mitzi shemra about innocent people in order to protect the town. He writes about Riches that there's a story like this. It seems there was a fight amongst two camps of Jews and it was leading to government intervention that was going to lead to spiral out of control and have terrible ramifications. And the Rabbanim, the Ramah, amongst them, paskin to bashmutz a certain kvutza of the Yidden to the Goyim and say it's very hard to glean the details. There is no one knows the details of what the Ramah is talking about. But in it, what he's writing is that he had to be Moitzi Shemra, a whole kvutza of Jews, to prevent them from falling into the hands of the Goyim. And part of his rationale is that just like by a Saita, you're allowed to destroy the Parsha of the Torah in order to bring Shalom Bayis, so too I'm allowed to do the Isser of Moitzi Shemra in order to bring Shalom to Klal Yisrael. But in it, he uses, the language that he uses is that you could be Ma'abid, Sifrei Kodesh, B'yadayim, to bring Shalom. So Rav David Singer asks Rav Moshe, from this Ramah you seem to see that in order to do a mitzvah, or to accomplish a desirable goal, you're allowed to be Ma'abid Svarim B'yadayim. So in order for a guy to be able to wear tefillin, you should be able to bring the tefillin into the isolation ward, so they should be able to wear it, even though it's even b'yadayim. To which Rav Moshe basically makes Chaim Tzvi's face, and does very different. It's an interesting tshuva, and nonetheless. Okay, v'chol and thank you.
You've just experienced another Torah class brought to you by TorahAnytime.com.